But actually this project is a huge collaboration of really interesting organisations, and I do feel privileged to work with colonies with her colleagues across the continent, including Warsaw Zoo. We work with professionals from the University of East Anglia talking about migration. We work really closely with the Cotswold Wildlife Park, who are in charge of our captive breeding programme, which I'll come on to in a few minutes' time, as well as Vaughan-Hirsch, which is a release site, and of course the Knepp Estate, as well as a couple of others as well. So it's a massive collaboration of experts, and we rely on everybody's input to make this project the success that it has been so far. Now, the overall aim of this reintroduction is to have a self-sustaining breeding population of wild storks in the south of the UK. We said by the year 2030, and we have kind of come up with a figure of, we think that looks like 50 breeding pairs in the south of the UK by 2030. But as with everything in kind of nature and conservation, numbers are numbers, and nature will do what it wants to do. But we do have to have kind of a target in mind, and I'm pleased to say that we are really going well along that journey, and our colony is establishing. The project started in the year 2016, and I'll talk you through a bit of data and give you updates on where we are so far. But what, like I said, what we're aiming for is this wild, free-living population of storks in the south of the UK in the next few years. So, first off, why this particular species? Why white storks? Why have we selected them? In this time of biodiversity crisis, there are a number of species that you can choose to reintroduce. You will all have heard stories of white storks throughout history. Those Aesop's fables of the stork and the fox, you've heard those stories about storks bringing babies. Those kind of examples exist throughout literature. There are storks written in medieval banquet menus. People used to eat storks across the UK and across the continent a few hundred years ago. But more relevant to us perhaps, locally to where Knepp is the town of Storrington, only about 10 miles down the road. The town of Storrington still has a pair of storks on its village emblem, and the town name Storrington is understood to mean homestead of the storks in Vaughan-Hirsch. There are multiple examples of archaeological records of storks in the area, and lots of examples of storks coming across the channel each year, looking for a place to land, looking for representatives of their species for the last few decades, and then going back again across the continent, not having found any storks in the area. We know from working with partners across the continent that storks have evolved to live really closely to villages, to people, to towns. They will happily nest on church roofs, even on house roofs, and they're a species that has evolved to live close by to humans. So what we see this species as is not an ecological keystone species, but if you like, a social keystone species. They're a large, charismatic, easily recognisable bird that really draw people into thinking about nature and country. So the project aims to reintroduce storks to an area where we believe they once were. But more than that, use them as a catalyst for nature recovery, for landscape recovery, in particular wetlands, which obviously have suffered over the last few hundred years. Across the continent, they're an absolutely beloved species, and this is what we're hoping to achieve in our project over the years, is to have things like stork festivals in Germany, in France, and Portugal. They will celebrate the return of the storks in spring, and we're looking to achieve that and get the same level of excitement for this wonderful species in Sussex. So a little bit about their ecology. As you will know, these are a large bird, standing up to sort of a metre tall. The males tend to be slightly bigger than the females, wingspan of about 180 centimetres, females slightly smaller. They're one of the highest flying species in the world. They've been recorded at most up to about 5 kilometres above the surface of the Earth, but lower than that. They are an incredibly high flying bird, relying on thermals for their migration, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a few minutes' time. But they're predominantly wetland birds that need a mix of habitats in order to thrive. One of the key things with white storks is they are hugely social, surprisingly social, colonial birds that need to have a number of their own species in an environment in order to feel safe, feel secure and thrive. This picture is taken by one of my colleagues over in Portugal, where, as you can see, the storks, their nest platforms have been put up to encourage them to nest, but they love to be almost within, my colleague would say, almost within stabbing distance of each other. That's their favourite place to nest. And this is where what we've started to see at Knepp. We've even had trees with up to 3 or 4 potentially form nests in the same tree. So they like to be really, really close to each other. They've got a really interesting loose social hierarchy where there is a more dominant pair. It tends to be a more experienced pair in terms of breeding, and they tend to have not always a very obviously dominant nest, but one that tends to be more central to the colony and perhaps higher up in the colony as well. And that tends to be the dominant pair. They might breed first, they might migrate first, they might have more young. And again, what we're starting to see in our Sussex colony is these interesting social dynamics start to develop. You have young males try and take over the nest of other males, and you have really interesting interactions that are just beginning to make themselves a bit more obvious. You'll read that storks mate for life, they're not mate for life. That's not necessarily what we've seen in ponies. What we tend to see is if stork pairs get together, if male and female tend to get together quite young, they're quite likely to go off and then find other partners. So these animals can live for up to 30 years, but that tends to be in captivity. The record, I think, in the Netherlands is about 32 years old. In the wild, they'll do well to reach 20 to 25 years of age, and they're fertile right up until they die. So they can reproduce. Maturity comes from about 4 years old, so they can reproduce from about 4 onwards. As I said, if they get together when they're young, 4 or 5, they might very well stick together, but they migrate separately. And what we tend to see is if they come back at very different times, the male tends to come back first. If the male comes back first and the female doesn't come back for a couple of weeks, he will look to attract the male, or he will go hop around nests, and the female will do the same. So although you might see in the literature, they make life, it's not necessarily what we record. They seem to be more loyal to their nesting site than they are to their actual partner. So really interestingly, they'll build these phenomenal nests. In that picture shows one on the top of a building, which they'll really regularly use. Up to a ton, easily 2 metres wide, easily 3 metres deep, and they come back to the same nest year after year after year. And like I said, they tend to be territorial and more loyal to the nest itself than perhaps to the partner, which is really interesting. Now, the nests can be made of, obviously, of a multitude of different species, of twigs, of sticks. At Knepp, we've done a little bit of a loose analysis, and we've seen them using willow, definitely oak, definitely hazel, even blackthorn around the edge, almost acting kind of like barbed wire, which is really interesting. And they'll use, to start off the nest, they'll use really straggly, windy bits, and you'll see them flying through the air with these really windy bits of material, and that's to start off in the tree. They can weigh up to a ton. So what we found in Knepp is all of our nests this year, so far, are in these kind of ancient, wonderful, beautiful oak trees. And the likelihood is they're probably the only thing in our landscape that are tough enough and strong enough to withstand the weight of a stork nest. They're huge structures. But across the continent, they will absolutely use different species of tree, they'll use buildings, they'll use, like I mentioned, church towers, houses, and posts that have been specifically put up to stork nests as well. Now, we did have them nesting on the castle at Knepp. At one point, they've not come back to that nest yet this year, which is interesting. We successfully did rear chicks off that nest, and we've had. But what's been quite interesting is in the last couple of years, they seem to have really kind of condensed the colony a little bit. There's 1 or 2 anomalies of nests far away. The nests seem to be quite close together, and at the moment, all in oak trees. We did put up platforms, wooden platforms, and we followed methodology of different projects across the continent. Our storks are completely ignored them. We've got over a dozen, I believe, different heights, different designs. They've completely ignored them so far, favouring these oak trees, which is really interesting. Now, if you look really closely at this picture here, at the bottom right, you'll see that there's a couple of house sparrows that are nesting at the bottom of this particular nest, which is a picture from Spain, actually. And for me, this is a really interesting part of the whole project. We are looking to reintroduce storks, but we are looking to reintroduce a species that we believe was in the landscape kind of over 600 years ago. And across the continent, you will get sparrows, you'll get different finches, starlings, even parakeets successfully rearing their chicks at the bottom of the stork nest, which is smart, for 2 reasons. One, there's not a lot of birds of prey that are going to go for a stork. White-tailed eagle, possibly. Some other things will get in there when the chicks are young, if the parents are not sitting with the chicks. But storks are really defensive if they're young, and they've obviously got 30cm beaks on their faces, which they're very happy to use. So if you're a little finch or a parakeet nesting on a stork nest, you've instantly got a defensive mechanism on top. Secondly, the nest is disgusting, if I'm honest. Storks don't do that lovely thing that some birds of prey do, where they pick bits of meat and drop it into the chick's mouth. They don't do that. They take a whole bunch of food and then they regurgitate it within the nest. They do tend to excrete around the edge, but not reliably. So what you end up with is a really smelly, if I'm honest, that really smelly nest that attracts a whole bunch of invertebrates. It attracts flies, it attracts beetles, and you can even see the nest. I know it's kind of a disgusting image, but you can see the nest kind of buzzing when it comes to the height of summer. For us, it's not that nice when we have to go up and remove them, which I'll talk about. But for these guys, it's really, really smart. You've got a food supply right there. So we do get, and my colleagues will watch small passerines feeding off the invertebrates that are literally flying around the stork nest itself. It's a food source for them. So again, this is something that we're really interested in. This symbiosis has been missing in our landscape for perhaps 600 years, perhaps more. There's a town in Germany, a stork village. There are various stork villages across the continent. And there's a story where one of the nests there, the villagers believe, has been in use by a pair of storks for over 300 years consecutively, obviously different birds.
But to me, that's a really, really wonderful example of something that I think about when I walk around at Knepp and look at these fantastic structures in the landscape that potentially could be here for long after I've gone, and all the interesting symbioses that will occur within them. So, as I mentioned, the chicks get fed by the parents through this regurgitation. Storks can have up to typically 5 eggs, which they lay every other day, so obviously taking around 10 days to lay their eggs. Typical incubation period is between 32 to 34 days, and then the young birds will take about 10 weeks before they are able to start developing their wing muscles and practicing flying, and eventually go off to fledge. After they do fledge, they're likely to come back to the nest for a couple of weeks, usually about 2 weeks, sometimes a little bit longer, and they continue to get fed by the parents, and then they're off. And lots of them do migrate within their first year. Something that's really lovely about this species is the clattering that they do, which you might have seen videos of, and it's that wonderful, joyous sound where the partners return to the nest and they throw their heads back and they're just clapping their bills together. They've got kind of a pouch which they just enlarge with air that really amplifies the sound. And the chicks learn to do it from about 3 days old. So when they hatch, they've got these heads that are too big for their bodies. They can't really move. But within about 3 days, they learn to do this clattering, this joyous greeting. And when the parents come back to feed, the chicks will throw their heads back and do a little mini version, which is lovely to see. They similar to lots of birds, they do this almost sort of branching out like some owls do. They will exercise from about 10 weeks old, and it can be quite nerve-wracking for some of us to watch, because sometimes you think you're too young to fledge, but they'll be jumping almost 1.5 meters off the nest as they're flapping and developing their wing muscles, and then eventually they'll be ready to go. In terms of their diet, they are one of the most kind of generalist. They're carnivorous species, but they really are not fussy at all. So typically, particularly at this time of year and over winter, we will get storks absolutely thriving on earthworms, particularly this winter where the water level has been so high, everything's been pushed up. So our storks will just be walking around, and you can watch them pretty much all day long. In the fields at Knepp, we've got scrubland, we've got grassland, we've got mixed woodland. They're looking for worms, but they'll take any invertebrate at all. They like surprisingly small things for such a big animal. So throughout winter, they're going around, they're hoovering up worms. Throughout summer, they might be collecting grasshoppers, certainly all manner of different species of beetles, and then they will take the occasional small mammal. They would take chick of other bird if they came across it and if they needed to. The largest thing we've recorded at Knepp is juvenile rabbit. So we've recorded a stork swallowing a juvenile rabbit as well. But snails, slugs, even butterflies, we've recorded them chasing and catching invertebrate after invertebrate. In other parts of the world, they will go after locust swarms, and they will collect thousands of locusts over the period of days when locusts emerge. Being these opportunistic generalist feeders has meant that they have adapted over the last few years to find food source in landfill sites. So particularly in Spain, in Portugal, and in some other areas as well, where landfill is more exposed, they have learned to utilise this as a food source. So they will readily take organic material from households, from restaurants, and from things like the poultry industry and butcheries as well. And what we have found is that some storks are spending pretty much all year on landfills. Now, like I said, this is a relatively recent development in the species, and it's providing us with some really, really interesting stories. And again, I was talking to one of my colleagues from a Portuguese project, and they were investigating storks at landfill site over in Portugal. And they found that these storks over a number of years learnt to just stay at this landfill site all year round. So they're a migratory species, which we'll get onto in a moment. And for years and years, they would go off to North Africa and come back and go off and come back. And then they found that this food source was so reliable, it was there all year round in Portugal, that they just stayed at the landfill until they had their chicks. And this was a really interesting development a few years ago. So the storks that decided to build their nest at the side of the landfill, and they decided to breed there, they were eating off the landfill every single day of the year until their eggs hatched and they had chicks. And as soon as their chicks hatched, they left the landfill and they went and foraged about 5 kilometres away and started searching for insects, invertebrates. And they brought those back to the chicks. And for the first 30 days of the chicks' life, that is what they were feeding them rather than the landfill food, which was fascinating. It's this intrinsic knowledge that this is not as high quality a food source as the insects over here. When the chicks reached about 30 days of food, the parents were like, that's enough, we're back on the landfill. And just started feeding off the landfill again, and that was it. So it's this really fascinating bit of behaviour that I'm sure we're going to learn more about as the years go on. Looking at that picture, I'm sure all of us have the same kind of queries in mind. What does this mean for the survival, the lifespan of the storks that are choosing to live off the landfill in terms of pathogens and in terms, of course, of plastics? And it's kind of obvious. We've already been able to tell that the young will accidentally ingest plastics, and sadly they do have a fairly high mortality from ingesting plastics, just like you get with birds getting wrapped up in fishing wire and all that kind of stuff. You do get the young get caught up in plastics from landfill as well. So it's going to be really interesting to see what that means in terms of mortality, whether that readily available food source outweighs the risk of being amongst plastics, and whether it affects immunity, whether there is pathogens, viruses to consider as well. I think we're going to learn more and more about sort of landfill as a food resource as the years go on. But a really interesting bit of behaviour. We've had some fantastic research. Shen is here today from our storks and diet at Knepp over last year. So we've had some fantastic research taking place looking at the pellets, the regurgitated pellets, so all the indigestible parts, in the same way that birds of prey will regurgitate these pellets. And you've spent many, many hours in the lab dissecting the pellets to find out more about what our storks at Knepp are actually eating. And I believe that this paper is due to come out very, very soon, and we'll happily circulate that. But it's going to be some fantastic information. But what I can tell you already is exactly what I said is kind of what Shennis has found out. So huge amounts of beetles, huge amounts of earthworm being consumed on site at Knepp, with the occasional really interesting find like field vole jawbones. So they will absolutely take small mammals. And then the occasional hairband. So our storks are, you know, they're prone to this problem as well. So they're obviously mistaking something like this for a worm, I would imagine. But they are generalist feeders. They are used to picking lots and lots of different items, and we've found that that has become a problem even in our storks at Knepp. So how does the reintroduction, how does this translocation actually work? I'll talk to you a little bit about the methodology that we have followed. As I mentioned, the project started in the year 2016. Project partners went out and saw the project in Sweden, and we've copied the successful methodology of stork reintroduction projects across the continent. Storks declined across the continent for the same reason everywhere. Drainage of wetland for agriculture, increase in pesticides, and hunting for food and for sport as well. So there was an enormous decline a few centuries ago, and then actually lots of European countries started a white stork reintroduction project over 50 years ago, and as we sometimes are, we're actually quite late to the party by reintroducing them in the south of the UK. So we're following successful methodology. what that looks like, broadly speaking, is kind of three main phases of the reintroduction. The first phase, which took place for the first couple of years, starting in 2016, was all about bringing over birds from Poland, which were injured in the wild, and their injuries meant that they can never fly again. So rehabilitated birds over from Poland and keeping them safe in a really large predator-proof pen. So at Knepp, we've got a 6-acre pen with lovely mixed habitat. We've got a big, large pond in the middle, mixed woodland, scrub, grassland, everything that a stork could ever want. And we brought over around 30 individual birds from Poland that can never fly again. In Poland, they tend to fly into electricity pylons and sometimes have collisions with traffic, which mean they might have a whole wing amputated or perhaps half a wing. Fortunately, these are incredibly resilient birds. As we'll all know, for many species of birds, that would be game over. But they're really, really resilient, and Warsaw Zoo did a fantastic job of rehabilitation. They were brought over to Cotswold Wildlife Park for quarantine, and then they were brought to us. Now, the whole point, and this is a video from a few years ago showing, you can kind of make out the pen. This is obviously some drone footage, and you can make out the storks, just to give you an idea of the landscape that they're in. The whole point of this part of the project is to create a magnet, to create we call it kind of a nucleus of a colony, so that if any wild storks fly over, which they do, there are multiple records of storks, like I mentioned, flying over from the continent, crossing the channel, looking up and down the south coast for any evidence of other storks, not seeing any, and then going back again. So the whole point of this is, when we do get wild storks flying over, they will see other storks in the environment, they will see it as a stork habitat, and they will fly in and they will join the colony. The reason this species has needed an active reintroduction is for that reason. They are so social, they're highly gregarious, highly social animals, and they just simply won't go to an environment unless they can at least see evidence of other storks there. So step one was to get these magnet birds that are going to be there for the rest of their life. We don't know the age of all of them. Most of them are wild birds originally, as I described. They're injured. So bearing in mind they can potentially live up to 30 years, we've got them, and they're ours to look after for a number of years. Phase two was all about starting to get a population that could fly, but that was loyal to our site. So what we did is we had a covered enclosure. We got some more birds over, but this time they could fly. What we did was we kept them in a covered enclosure for 2 years. And the idea of that was to get them loyal to our site. So to fly around the site, but encourage them to become loyal to our site so that they would eventually stay. And what we did after that, and the phase that we're in at the moment, is encourage a breeding population, but a migratory population. And that's the key bit that we're up to from now. So alongside all of this stuff, with our colony at Knepp, we've also got another colony that is very similar to the drone footage that you just saw over in East Sussex at Vaughan-Hirsch. So these sites are about 30 miles away from each other, and we are wanting to create a dynamic population that can move between sites, that can find habitats for themselves that they want to be in, and fly between each other. So we've got Knepp, we've got Vaughan-Hirsch. We've now got a breeding population at Knepp, which I'll talk about. And on top of that, we are doing releases of juvenile birds each summer from a population that are bred in captivity at Cotswold Wildlife Park. So each year, Cotswold Wildlife Park bring any white storks that they breed to us. They're absolute experts in avian breeding, and we release them from our site at Knepp. The idea of that is to really bolster the numbers. Sadly, as much as this is a long-lived species, they also have really high mortality rate. So you would actually only expect about 10% of your juvenile storks to return as adults, 10%. So we bolster the numbers each year to encourage migration and to ensure that our colony numbers actually develop to the point where we've got this self-sustaining population. So the point where we are at the moment is we've now got an open-top pen. We've still got about 25 non-flying birds, the originals from Poland, that will be there forever. We've got a number of birds that we describe as hefted to our site, that are loyal to the site, that overwinter in Sussex. They've lost the inclination to go and migrate. And every single year, we've now got birds breeding and flying off and migrating. So that's kind of where we're at in the project at this point in time. We won't get any more non-flying birds at this stage. So when that population goes, when they die of old age, that'll be it. The fence will come down, and hopefully by then we will have a wild, free breeding population of white storks in the south. So our colony only started breeding in the year 2020. And just to give you kind of some highlights, I suppose, we started off with 4 chicks fledging across 2 nests, which was obviously really exciting and not that long ago. In the year after, that number rose up to 14 chicks across 6 nests. And that's a nice little bit of footage from a very typical nest, I would say. This one's slightly further away from the main colony, but about 20 metres up in the tree, and that one had about two chicks in. That's what they look like out in the wild. And then on to more recent years. In the year 2022, we had 20 chicks fledged from the wild, and then last year we had 26 chicks fledged from the wild, including our first ever chicks from ground nests. For us, that was a bit of a landmark in the project, and it was really a lovely achievement. So those birds that can't fly, that are acting like a magnet, we were hoping that they were going to start breeding. And eventually they did. Eventually they felt kind of secure enough, and they paired up. Like I described, there's this interesting loose social structure, and the pairs eventually kind of matured and got together, and we ended up with 2 ground nests. Obviously they can't fly, they can't build their nests up in the tree, but they developed these wonderful structures almost kind of at hip height. One of the nests was on the ground, and 3 chicks fledged across those 2 ground nests. I'm going to talk more about them in a couple of minutes. So from all of those birds and from all of the success we've had in terms of breeding, really the project, a hugely important part of the project is learning about what happens to the birds after they leave us, learning about numbers, migration and mortality and all of that information. And we get a lot of information on our birds, I suppose, from 3 main ways. So from ringing, from satellite tagging, and from camera trap data as well. So first of all of our birds in the wild are ringed with these blue Darvik rings on the left tarsus, starting with GB obviously for Great Britain. And I get a huge amount of sightings from definitely across the south of the UK, but also from across the continent. And sometimes we get phenomenal sightings. People will take pictures on their phone or videos and say, I think I've got your stork in my field. I'm over in the south of Spain. And they'll take a picture of a stork which I can trace has come back from Knepp or has come from Knepp, and we can trace the exact nest it's come from, which is a really wonderful part of the project and given us some fantastic stories. The project is under the BTO, so they've also got a metal BTO ring on the right ankle. Secondly, and actually I should talk about the ringing process itself. So the ringing is a really exciting part of the year and a really lovely part of the year for us. As I mentioned, some of these nests can be 20, 25 metres high. So for some of them, we rely on really skilled tree climbers to get up there. For some of them, we get a cherry picker, which will get us up to the nest. And then we typically bring the storks down in an IKEA bag, which happens to be the right strength and the right size. Obviously, these stork chicks are typically about 3.5 kilograms. We take them down, we process them, we take beak length, leg length, wingspan, we weigh them, we've got all their records, we give them a ring, and we take a feather sample for genetic sexing as well. And that whole process takes about 5 minutes. So we process them really, really quickly, and then they go back up in the nest again. While we're doing that, they're a lovely species to work with because the chicks just play dead. So they're really sweet because they've got their eyes open, but they absolutely just play dead, and they let you kind of take all these measurements without any kind of stress at all. And the parents tend to kind of fly around. They're very much there. They're very much watching what's going on, but they don't interfere at all, and the whole thing is done quite quickly. So that's our ringing. We've had some really interesting recoveries from ringing. So just to give you a little bit of data, we've had at least 50 birds being confirmed as having migrated over the course of the years. So started breeding in 2020, but our first migrations were from 2019 onwards. We've ringed over 200 birds in the wild, so we've got a huge data set, and we continue to get recoveries and information back from all over the place. Like I mentioned, they reach maturity typically at sort of 4-ish years old. So from this point of the project onwards, we're expecting to see some really interesting things in terms of returns. So they go off in their first year, they can sometimes explore for a few years, and then when they get the urge to breed, they tend to come back to their their colony at least. So this spring, and perhaps over the following couple of years, we're hoping and expecting some really interesting returns. Now the other really important bit of data, but sad bit of data it gives us is obviously about deaths. So we have had 24 confirmed deaths. The truth is, as I mentioned, they've got really high mortality. It's likely to be that that number in reality is much higher. But where we do have deaths, we do ask for post-mortem if possible. And we've got some really interesting data from that. So the thing that tends to get the young birds, particularly the first years that are not as experienced with flying, is collision with electricity pylons. And we've seen a lot of this in France, but not just France, Spain, outside Malaga, outside Madrid. We've sadly had birds died due to electrocution or collision with electricity pylons. There have been other deaths as well, sadly including traffic collisions and things like that. But again, we're likely to get more data over the following years. The second data set that I mentioned is from camera traps within Knepp Pen itself and Vaughan-Hirsch Pen and the Cotswold Wildlife Park. So I work with an absolutely incredible team of volunteers who give up huge amounts of time to analyse data and look at information. And one of the jobs that some of the volunteers do is they look at camera trap data. We've got about 8 individual camera traps within that 6-acre pen. And we collect huge amounts of data on behaviour, on diet, and on migratory returns as well from within the pen. So these are some images, just to give you a bit of an example of what we've found out. And actually, this one at the bottom left was literally taken over the weekend this year. So this is a really lovely, exciting piece of news. Our ground nest, this nest, was active and built for the first time ever last year. And they laid a new egg just this weekend, just gone. So we're really happy. And that's the first image from this year of the egg on that particular ground nest. So we've got our fingers crossed that we'll get some more and that they will be successful again. But information like that is absolutely priceless to us, and it's thanks to camera traps and volunteer dedication that we can collect that. The third piece of data that we can collect is from GPS satellite tracking, and this is a really fascinating data set for us. So we satellite tag. If you look at the top right picture, you can just about make out a little box. It's about that big. It's got a solar panel on it. So we satellite tag typically between 8 and 10 birds per year of our cohort. So we had 26 chicks fledge in the wild last year, and we released just over 30 from the Cotswold Wildlife Park, and we satellite tagged 8 of those birds. So those satellite tags obviously give us information on location, sending location data twice a day to us, but they also give us information on altitude, on temperature, on velocity as well of the bird. So they give us a really, really important data set to find out about movement and behaviour. We try and tag as many birds as we can, but of course we'll only tag fit and healthy juveniles. So I work with a colleague from Portugal who has tagged literally hundreds of storks, and we assess each individual to make sure that it's kind of strong and robust enough to take the tag, even though they're really obviously designed to be really, really light and not obtrusive. We only want to put it on the fittest and healthiest birds. The other thing is they're really expensive. They cost about £1,000 each. So we can't tag all the birds that we would like to tag. We rely on funding for it. But they have given us some very fascinating bits of information. Unlike the ringing, which takes, I described it takes 5 minutes, for the tagging, we get the bird in the same way. And then actually what we do is we put a little hood on it and it falls asleep. And getting the tag on the bird in itself is quite a tricky process, which was a steep learning curve for me. So the bird wears the tag a bit like a backpack. It's got 4 straps of Teflon material that kind of attach at the front. And it takes about 40 minutes to sew it on properly. And it has to be exactly the right, obviously exactly the right length of material to make sure that the bird isn't under any risk at all. I've got a bird on my lap at that point in time. And the first time I did it, I was very nervous because it was floppy and it was making a really, really odd sound. It's got a little hood on and it was kind of making a really odd sound, and I said to my colleague, I'm a bit worried about this. Do we need to let it go? What's going on? And she listened and she said, it's snoring. It's just falling asleep. It's absolutely fine. So it's a lovely part of the process for us, and a really fascinating part of the process. Now, what we've managed to do that I'm particularly thrilled about, because we managed to do it for the first time last year from all that satellite tag data, is we've managed to work with a fantastic company called Ace Nature, who have developed live maps, which is available to everybody. So if you're interested, you can go on our website. I've taken pictures of all of the birds that we have satellite tagged and written stories about where they're from. You can see the exact nest that they're from, and you can see where they've travelled to. And for us, really, this is what the project is all about, finding out where these birds are going, where they're stopping. So I know the colours aren't great, but if you're interested, you can look on this on our website later on. The larger circles are where they're stopping off for longer amounts of time. And hopefully, we will eventually be able to track their return all the way back to the south of the UK. And we're going to continue to do that in years to come and add to this data set. But what we have found out from our data, and obviously from working with colleagues and the data that's out there, there's this kind of east-west migratory divide for European white storks. Our storks, we weren't really sure where they were going to go the first sort of few times they migrated. The more easterly population can migrate to central and all the way down to southern Africa for their overwintering. So typically they leave for overwintering in late August. Some of ours actually left a lot later. Some of ours last year left in October. And typically they start returning end of February all the way through March, really. So as I mentioned, the easterly population might go to central, might go to southern Africa, and the western population tend to go to North Africa and kind of stay there. And we weren't sure, that sort of divide appears to be somewhere in Germany. We weren't exactly sure what our birds were going to do, given that they were Polish origin, and given that there hasn't been migrating returns in the UK for 600 plus years. But we have had successful migrations and we have had successful returns. So a little bit about what we found out so far. One of our first migrants back in 2019 completed this really wonderful journey, which has since been replicated by a few individuals over the years. To give you kind of a typical migration, it might take anywhere up to sort of 50 days. I believe we had one complete it in about 33 days in 2023, so a really quick journey. You can see the journey on the board there, eventually ending up at the Strait of Gibraltar and crossing across into Morocco. So speed varies, stopover days vary hugely actually between individuals. You can really analyse the data and look at their individual trips. And it's likely, of course, to depend on conditions. So storks rely heavily on thermal uplifts. They like to soar, they're gliders. It's very energetically demanding for such a large bird to be flapping. So what they will do is they will wait for, obviously, it to be quite warm, and then they will, we call it kettling, they will go up by the hundreds, as high as they possibly can, and then they will glide in the direction that they need to be migrating. That's possibly the reason why they look for the shortest expanse of water to cross. Obviously, thermal's not forming in the same way. So typically what they'll do in the south of the UK, the first-year migrants, is go up and down the coast, probably looking for the narrowest point to cross. And they do tend to cross Dover to Calais and then go all the way down to Strait of Gibraltar and over into Morocco. So phenomenal journeys that they've managed to complete, but they don't always take that route. So these two last year were the first two off that ground nest that I showed you a picture of. So we got to know these two incredibly well, and actually they were really interesting to work with. That was a male and a female in that nest, and we actually were supplementary feeding those two particular birds just because the parents, neither of the parents could fly. So for that year we decided to give them a little bit of extra food because the parents couldn't go off to forage. Almost as soon as they hatched, they had these really distinct personalities. So it turned out to be the male was incredibly aggressive, unfortunately, and would try and bite our hand off when we got anywhere near him, would stand up, would be in a defensive pose, even though we were delivering fish, and would screech and try and attack. And the female would just play dead, and I barely ever saw her eat. She had a real understanding of where we were looking, so she did not move until I turned my back, which was really, really interesting. Anyway, We managed to satellite tag both of these two birds, and they managed to migrate. Now, they took until October, but look at the journey that they chose to go to. So they left quite late, and they crossed a really wide expanse of water. Probably the case is they left quite late, so most of the other storks had already migrated. They rely on experienced individuals, and they very much follow experienced individuals. So they probably left it a little bit late, and there wasn't anyone experienced to follow, and then they ended up crossing almost kind of this Isle of Wight route, and then ending up in France. But the really lovely thing is, we know they're in France, we know that they're doing well, they've got trackers on, and we've also got a couple of members of the public who sent me a few pictures of them. So we're really interested to find out how they get on and whether they manage to return in the following years. Here's another individual from last year that did complete, like I said, completed this very typical journey, this one taking just over 30 days. So this individual, GBE4, is a female. This one was born at the Cotswold Wildlife Park, released at Knepp mid-August last year, and then only hung around for a few days. And then the urge to migrate was clearly really strong, and she went crossing at the narrowest point and going all the way down to Morocco. When she got to Morocco, I had a lovely message on Facebook from a gentleman over in Morocco he's actually a retired vet, and he messaged me in French, which sadly I don't speak, so I had to use Google Translate. But this is what he said. He said, "I think I've got a picture of your stork." He looks after an amazing population of storks. He's a birder over there. He's really interested in the white stork population. And he took this fantastic picture of our bird over in amongst a huge colony, a huge flock of storks. He said there's thousands of them. He promises me that mine is one of those in that top right picture over there. Who knows? And we got into a really interesting dialogue about our project in the UK and his environment over there. And I said, what are the storks doing in Morocco? And this is what he told me. So he said, this is a marsh. I go and observe a marsh. We get hundreds and potentially thousands of storks. Some of them stop over for just a few days. There are tens of thousands. There are some that overwinter here and some that come back year after year after year to this environment. He said they're feeding off the marsh, and he did describe how they're getting amphibians and fish a little bit and invertebrates, but actually also they're provided with a lot of food from essentially landfill, so a waste disposal unit as well. So there's this mix there. So they're using the marsh, clearly, you can see the good habitat, but they're also using the leftovers from restaurants, from household waste, from, he says, the poultry industry as well. So we've gotten into this really interesting dialogue, and I've kept in touch with him. And he has described how our stork is mixing with storks from across the whole of Europe, across the continent, and actually, if you look at the top left there, mixing with flamingos as well out in the wild too, which is really, really lovely to see. For me, and for us in the project, this is a really, really crucial element, because we're absolutely supporting the reintroduction, and we're trying to increase the population of our storks in the UK and so on. But more broadly, over the years, what we're really looking to do is safeguard habitat and food resources all the way along the migration route. We're looking to connect communities across the continent and connect with individuals all the way down to North Africa and get everybody engaged and excited by storks and wider landscape recovery, wetland recovery that benefits all species. And that, for me, is one of the really, really exciting bits of the project. So, just a couple more stories on that. This year, we've had a successful return. So very recently, literally a couple of weeks ago, we had a wonderful, again, social media. I've not used social media my whole life, but I'm starting to enjoy it in this job. We had a wonderful message on Instagram, I think, from a zookeeper over in the Netherlands, a place called Beekse Bergen, who said, I think I've got one of your storks. And again, he sent me some videos and took some pictures, and it ended up being, it's this guy on the left is the male. So he is a male hatched at the Cotswold Wildlife Park in 2019, and we tracked his sightings from pictures from the public. He's not got a satellite tag, so this is all relying on public sightings. And we found out that he went over to Germany in 2020, then he went up to the Netherlands in 2021, and then he wasn't seen again until January 22, and he spent a couple of years, or a year and a half or so, in Spain. And then he's come back up to the Netherlands, where he seems to have got himself a partner, a wild bird from the Netherlands, and they've paired up and they've built a nest at a safari park. And again, the zookeeper described to me how they're a wild colony of storks, kind of similar to how our colony will eventually be completely wild. They don't feed them, they don't provide them with any kind of nesting structures or anything like that. There is what looks like a beautiful island with pine trees, and they've got a colony of about 40 pairs of storks which are breeding and all nesting on these pine trees and then going and foraging in kind of surrounding agricultural fields. And our stork is partnered up with a bird that he thinks is from the Netherlands and on a nest, and if he does breed this year, it will be our first successful return breeding anywhere outside of our colonies in the south of England. So again, it's a really exciting time of year and an exciting part of the project for us, and hopefully we'll learn more from these reports. On to exciting things in the project. We've recently, and again, if you're interested in following this, we've recently managed to put up a live camera on one of our nests at Knepp, and this is providing us with a huge amount of information about behaviour. We're getting lots and lots of fascinating data, and luckily for me, these guys seem to kind of do their own PR. The day after we put the live camera up to the public, the first egg was laid on that nest, which happened to be the day before Mother's Day, so just a couple of weeks ago, which was lovely. So we believe, so again, you can go and have a look at this at home if you're interested. We believe we've got at least 4 eggs on this nest. At this point, it's really difficult to determine because they start putting really soft insulating materials, maybe straw and hay from the stables on site, soft leaves, lichen, moss, and they're protecting the eggs, but it makes it difficult for us to see. We've calculated that those eggs should hatch around mid-April, maybe from sort of 11th, 12th-ish of April, we hope. But we're getting fascinating clips of data, and if this video works, we'll see. There we go. We've got the male bringing in a bunch of soft leaves. To the incubating female and tucking her in, which is just really sweet.
Is she already on eggs?
She's on eggs there, yeah, she's on a couple of eggs. And it's honestly fascinating. I've wasted a lot of hours watching their disagreements over where to place a stick, watching their conversations that they seem to have. So it's been a fascinating part of the project for us. And that's maybe my favourite clip, but we've had tens of clips already. And yeah, hopefully we'll get to see chicks hatching and chicks fledging over the next weeks and months, I hope. So that's a really nice part of the project for us. So going forwards for the White Stork project, what is the plan? Obviously I've described how we're aiming to have this self-sustained, this breeding population, this wild population eventually. But just as important is continuing to get data to allow us to learn more and more about these birds, continuing to engage the public, the communities, not just in Sussex, but actually across the continent, and ideally connecting with communities from different cultures and different areas, using schools programs and using talks to engage people with landscape recovery, and using the stork as a bit of a catalyst and a lovable species to get that going. To continue these juvenile releases and learning about migration and continuing to establish this colony. And so far, we've had lovely bits of feedback from the public, and it seems to have drawn people into the project. This was a wonderful piece of art a couple of years ago when our first chicks hatched and they bred successfully for the first time back in 2020, and this mural appeared in Brighton, which was delightful. And we've had lots of different schools come and visit the project and get engaged with the project. And for me, obviously with a background in education, one of the lovely and inspiring things is seeing how engaged young people are. And on that, I'll end with this lovely video again. I hope it will play, but unknown to us, there was a primary school that was so taken in by the project a few years ago that they actually made this phenomenal model of a stork, primary school children, that they used in their the Brighton festival, and there's a nest in the background there as well. So they were so kind of inspired and moved by the project that they made this wonderful model. And for us, that kind of, or for me, that kind of encapsulates what the whole project is about. It's about the science, it's about the birds, but it's about the engagement and the wider reach as well. So I think that's it from me. Thanks very much for listening.
Laura, thank you so much for that. I've worked alongside the project for a little time, but I've learned so much tonight about the project and the history of it. It's a wonderful story. So the floor is yours for questions. Anyone who's got any questions for Laura, now's your opportunity. Tony.
I've had some familiarity mostly with stork in southern Africa, but I didn't know they nested on the ground at all. Is there a percentage in the total population that mirrors how they nest on the ground as opposed to in trees or something?
That's a great question. In the wild, they wouldn't, although there has been examples of wild storks starting nests on big compost heaps and things like that. So in the wild, the first question and we often get with these ground nests is, surely a predator would get them? And the answer is they would. So I don't think that there's really any successful examples of wild flying storks choosing to nest on the ground. But what's lovely about this species and this project is they're no longer able to nest in trees. So they took a few years to kind of work it out and recover. But now they still have the urge to nest and to reproduce, so they're building their nests on the ground.
Adapted to non-tree kind of environment.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's very interesting.
Yeah, and again, so Poland, Warsaw Zoo in Poland provided seed populations for actually lots of different projects, not just ours in the UK, and it was a similar pattern. So non-flying birds would go and start a seed population, and they would eventually start to breed on the ground and do this ground nesting, but it's not seen in the wild. They would probably just be predated.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, a comment to the question, if I may. The comment is that this is a species which we can hope will expand to nest more widely suddenly than across the country. One of the important things to do with this, because it's a bird that returns to a substantial nest every year, is to make sure that we start asking now for this to be added to the relevant section of the Wildlife and Countryside Act, so its nest is protected. Obviously not a net, it's no problem, but its nest is protected, particularly as they're likely to be perhaps on churches and houses and other development sites going forward. I mean, it takes a long time, as we all know, to change anything in legislation. The question was, have you had any ringing returns or sightings south of the Sahara yet from UK birds?
So it's a really good point on the comment, and something that as the partnership we've discussed and all that kind of stuff, as you can probably imagine, is going on in the background. And in answer to the question, any ringing returns south of Sahara? I think in short, no, not yet. No, not yet. Yeah, fingers crossed, it'd be wonderful. The furthest migration we have confirmed is Morocco, is North Africa. Yeah, but it'd be wonderful if we had evidence that they went further. I think so. I think so. Yeah, thank you.
So you haven't had any far south of South Africa?
Not from our birds, no.
Okay.
James.
Is there an understanding as to why the birds don't, or some of them don't migrate?
Yeah, that's a great question. Some of them just choose to overwinter in the UK. Again, I talk with these colleagues across lots of different projects. In short, nobody knows for sure what it is that will make some of these birds that are maybe the same age from the same colony, hatched at the same time. Some of them will go off and migrate and seem desperate to do that, and some of them will stay. And the interesting thing is sometimes they might stay for a couple of years and then they will choose to migrate. Sometimes they will not migrate, or they haven't migrated yet at all. So in short, we don't know for sure. We do know that socially, like I think I described, they rely on kind of bold, it's almost like a personality thing. They rely on bold individuals to start thermaling, to start going up and down the coast, and then they tend to follow. And then when they get across to the continent, they bump into more experienced, more mature individuals, and then they follow them all the way down to Gibraltar. But what actually causes some birds to migrate and some birds to stay, we don't know yet. It doesn't seem to be a genetic thing. It doesn't seem to be an age thing. There doesn't seem to be that pattern. It's almost it's almost a personality thing. It's almost a matter of boldness, and certainly a matter of timing as well. So if there's maybe one that's a little bit young and the rest of them are thermaling and getting ready to go, maybe it's hanging behind, maybe it will skip that year and it will go the next year. We've seen that a couple of times. So yeah, it's one of those things. I don't have a short answer, but there's loads of different components to it, and I imagine as the years go by we'll compile a data set that will give us a little bit more evidence.
So it's not a negative effect for the birds that don't migrate, they still do well.
They can successfully overwinter in the UK. They thrive on, as I described, worms and all that kind of stuff. They can happily live in our climate. So yeah, it's not a negative at all.
Very interesting talk. I've learned a lot. What, if anything, could be done or is being done to help the storks that don't migrate and the ones that stay on the landfill sites?
What is being done to help the storks on the landfill sites at the moment? There's a lot of scientists working and a lot of research being done. I don't know if they need help in terms of survival, because actually they're doing quite well. So they're getting this food source. They are rearing chicks. They actually get quite a good number of fledglings from their nests surrounding landfill sites at the moment. So I don't know if anything needs to be done in terms of kind of helping support their survival now, but what is being done is loads of research to understand if it affects lifespan, if anything can be done to kind of support with plastic issues, all that kind of stuff. So there's lots of scientists working at different parts to find out more at this stage. But yeah, it's a great question, and it's something that I'm really interested to learn more about as the years go on.